So the last topic on requirements is the topic of validation. This is kind of a new lecture this term, and it was pulled out some details from other lectures. And normally we used to teach this really early on in the course, but what I felt was that even though it's a very short lecture, it's much more useful to tell you these things toward the end of the course once you've had some time to think about it. And more specifically, it's important to understand the difference between verification and validation. We've already talked about validation and user acceptance test, well, verification and user acceptance testing, but let's put some more things in context. The quick recap for you on the left here, verification, we talked about this I think back in week 2 when we talked about dynamic verification. We also talked about static verification in week 3, but in week 2 dynamic verification was essentially just and writing tests. And what this was about was that it was a set of activities that compares a product of the system against the required characteristics for that product. Basically, verification is the process by which we test our code to make sure that the code is behaving like our specification set out to. So if we specify that the code, that the product should do X, we check that the code actually allows it to do X. What's interesting though is that validation is where we ensure or gain confidence that the system is able to accomplish its intended use, goals, or objectives. And this is really interesting because, we'll talk about an example in a sec too, but let's say again that you're building a table. Now, if you're building a table for people to put a TV on it, that's the kind of use, goal, and objective. But as part of that process, if you, for instance, as part of scoping, say that the table should be, 1 meter by 1 meter, and then you go and build the table, you could verify that that table's been built correctly by checking how big the table was built as and what the plan was. Yes, okay, the table was built to plan, but maybe that table is the wrong shape for someone with a TV to actually use it. Maybe people just don't like it. And, something I always like to think about with validation is that validation has a lot to do with people, because as engineers, most of what we do is really just about people. We're building things for people at the end of the day, or we're building things for other things that are built for people. It's all kind of comes back to people at the end. So validation is really actually making sure that what you ended up building achieves its goal and people like it. And the really nice summary of this is that, and I've always liked this little inversion because it's kind of cute, is that verification is trying to ensure that the system has been built right, and validation is trying to ensure that the right system has been built. So sometimes you could correctly build the wrong thing. You might be making a video game that everyone's really excited about, and then you build it right, and you do what you're told, and it works, and it's bug free, but it's just no one likes the game. It's boring. It's not fun. That could be a verified but poorly validated piece of software. And most of testing you do in this course is about verification, but now that we're on this topic of requirements and requirements engineering and interviews and listening to our customers and users, this is where you get more into that validation. So that's very important. It's about making sure that the right system is being built. Now, how do we validate our software? Well, validating software is really not that automatable. It's often the last step of software testing, and it comes well after unit integration and system tests, and it's honestly really just about talking to people. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as quality assurance or customer research or anything else like this, but it really and truly is just about how real people respond to the final product. This is kind of like, and also I think that another really simple way to break these up is that verification always has a lot to do with like quality assurance from a software perspective, like a software engineering programming perspective. Validation obviously though has a lot more to do with product management, project management, learning about customers, product ownership, and everything else. So the left is a lot more about, I guess, engineering, and the right's more about product. But I don't want you to look at validation as a topic and think, well, I don't really care about product and people and fluffy feelings. I just like coding. You should, though, because at the end of the day, it's a product that people want that is buggy is substantially more effective than a product that no one wants that's perfect. Because again, at the end of the day, you're always building for people. You're not building for the philosophical need to have correct software that no one uses, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Now, user acceptance testing, which we just talked about in the last lecture, really falls into this validation part because, as I mentioned, a lot of it's very high level, a lot of it's very chatting to real users and customers, and therefore it is about validating that the right system was built. A little like there's obviously an implied relevance here that that user acceptance testing will look for bugs too, because bugs are making sure that the system was built right. But it also does that validation element. And a really common way that you'll see this be achieved is in industry, you'll often hear about UAT environments, which is like a user acceptance testing environment. If you go back to our deployment lecture, a UAT environment is typically something that you will push to like a dev or a staging environment. And this is essentially like a holding area where kind of pre-production code goes, so that other engineers or product managers or something similar can go and actually give that to real people, and those real people can go and check it out and give feedback. Because maybe your software is bug free, but when real people actually use it in this like testing area, they go, oh, I don't know, this is really hard to understand, and then you can kind of go back and modify your software like that. So that's really about it. It's an extremely short lecture. It's like 5 minutes. Well, 7 minutes by the looks of things, but essentially it is just about validation compared to verification. Again, this was not normally its own lecture, but I think talking about validation in week 2 makes it get a little bit lost. It's much easier to come back at the end once we've talked about requirements and user stories and kind of go, okay, so validation is just that higher level, more human, more producty look at things to simplify, and verification is a bit more technical, software-led, looking for bugs and stuff like that. Are there any questions? Otherwise, we're pretty much at the end here. Otherwise, so I'll take a quick pause to see if people have questions. Otherwise, we'll wrap up and we're actually done for tonight. So really short week. The weeks do get shorter at the end of the term, making up for the busier start of term, which is good. Ethan says, so jest testing is like verification and our final mark is like validation. What I'd say is that you don't actually do a lot of validation in this course. It's something I don't love because I think validation is really important, but it's just really hard to do with closed-end projects. But what I'd say is that verification is basically what you're doing with tests in the course, with jest and stuff. Validation, though, would more be running your server with a front end and giving it to people and seeing if they actually find it useful. Because you might be passing all your tests, but people actually use the app and they're like, this is useless. Now, the reason that that's really hard to give to you as a topic is because that would imply that the front end is your problem and that you might have to modify the front end. That sounds like an amazing time to me. A course where, and there are courses semi like this, and they're trying to get more of them, thank God, but you being like having to test it with users and then they give feedback and you have to go and modify the front end and the back end to like get them to like it more. The point is that your code can always be bug free, but maybe people don't like what you produced. So maybe you built the wrong thing correctly. And this course focuses a lot predominantly on building the thing correctly and a little less on making sure that the thing is the right thing to have built correctly. Hope that answers your question. Cool. I'm just going to assume that that's it. So thank you all for the time. Hopefully that kind of fills you in a little bit on the validation stuff. Appreciate the short lecture, though. I'm sure many of you are thrilled.